Everything's marked? Everything's marked.
Yep.
All right, good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any matters that we need to take up before we bring the jurors out?
No, sir. No, sir. Not on that mistake.
All right, very good. Let's bring jurors then. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and proceed directly with further direct examination of Dr. Scott. Mr. Waller.
Thank you, Roger. Dr. Scott, when we broke yesterday, we were kind of finishing up talking about the different blows that Melissa suffered. When you say a blow, when you counted 18 total blows, what was the difference between the blows that you counted versus just the bruises? Was there a specific injury you were looking for to count it as a blow or injury to her?
The blows I was counting is any lacerations or abrasions that I felt were most likely related to someone else inflicting the injury.
And those blows, are those the blows that broke the skin?
Most of them, I believe. Perhaps all of them. There was one abrasion that I counted as a blow and one bruise on the nose that I counted as a blow, and those didn't completely break the skin.
And then when we were talking about the head and neck injury, you said there were 12 blows to the head and neck?
Yes.
And 3 of those were caused by a blunt object or by blunt force trauma, 5 by a sharp object, and 4 a combination of the 2?
Yes, there were some that were primarily sharp force, but also had some blunt force, and those were included with the 5 sharp force injuries that you mentioned.
And to be clear, the injuries caused by a sharp object, that would be something consistent with a knife. Is that correct?
Consistent with the knife or some instrument with a sharp cutting edge.
And then the 3 blunt force injuries that you described would be something consistent with a fist.
Consistent with a fist or some other object without a sharp cutting edge.
And then the four combination blows of the sharp and blunt force trauma, could those be caused by the same object, or again a combination of a a fist and a knife?
Most of those were more consistent with a knife, and they had a blunt force component to them, possibly for multiple different reasons. It could be that the knife used had a slightly dull blade. It could be just the angle that the knife was inserted into the skin, referring specifically to the chop wounds on the scalp and on the shoulder. A knife that's inserted with a downward motion of the blade rather than a across the skin motion, or with a point into the skin motion, could cause a chop wound depending on the particular knife used. Or it could be an object that has a heavy blade but also a sharp cutting edge to it.
And then on the body, you said there were 6 blows that you considered, 2 being sharp and 4 a combination of both. Is that right?
Yes.
You mentioned several terms yesterday I want to talk about just a little bit before we proceed. The chop wound, you've described that a little bit. What's the difference, though, between a chop wound and a puncture wound?
The puncture wounds were the 2 wounds that were on the upper chest just above the collarbones, and those were caused by a sharp instrument that was thin and narrow. The one on the left wasn't very deep and could have been caused by a knife tip or some other instrument with a sharp pointy tip. The one on the right upper chest had a depth of about 0.5 inches and a very narrow wound track, which to me indicates it was not caused by a knife, versus the chop wound, which is longer across the body surface, and the wound track itself was broader into the body.
And you also mentioned some of her injuries consisted of lacerations. What's a laceration?
A laceration is a blunt force injury where some object without a sharp cutting edge strikes the skin surface with enough force that the skin surface splits open due to the intense pressure.
I believe one of the lacerations you described was a gaping laceration. Is there a difference between a laceration and a gaping laceration?
It's a subjective determination. It's not scientific, but the laceration that I described as a gaping laceration was from the nose to the right cheek and had underlying bony injury to the upper jawbone and to the nasal bones.
Is there different? I mean, if a laceration is deeper or more severe, is that when you call it a gaping laceration?
That's my usual terminology, yes.
And then I believe you also mentioned an incised wound yesterday. What is an incised wound?
An incised wound is a sharp force injury from a knife, usually from a knife or some other object with a sharp cutting edge, scraping across the skin surface so that the lesion on the skin surface is longer than it is deep into the body.
And Dr. Scott, based on the different injuries there that you saw about Melissa, is there a possibility of different instruments being used during the course of this attack?
Yes.
You mentioned that her teeth were, or at least 2 of her teeth were knocked out, and then another 2 teeth were dislodged in her mouth. Can you
Yes.
describe that for us a little bit more?
The right upper incisor and the right upper canine were completely dislodged from her mouth, and that was as a part of the gaping laceration that went from the nose to the cheek. When that blow occurred, it happened with enough force to dislodge those 2 teeth, and then the 2 teeth next to it, the middle incisors, were partially detached from the gums. There was still a portion that was attaching them, but they weren't in their usual location. They were partially ripped away from the gum.
And based on your examination, would these be injuries knocking out her teeth that would be consistent with a blunt force trauma?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Scott, yesterday you mentioned that as part of your examination, you take photographs and do diagrams. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And have you had an opportunity to view those photographs and diagrams prior to today's court hearing?
I have.
And would those diagrams and photographs help illustrate your testimony?
They would.
I may approach the witness, right?
Yes, sir.
Mentioned yesterday that as part of your examination you do two different reports, a report of investigation by medical examiner and then the report of an autopsy examination. I'm going to hand you 385 and 386 and tell me if you recognize what those two documents are.
Document 385 is a copy of my autopsy report and also a copy of the toxicology report on the last 3 pages. Document 386 is a copy of the report of investigation by medical examiner for the case.
And do those documents appear to be in the same or substantially same condition as when you created them?
I did not create the toxicology report, which was the last 3 pages of document 385, but otherwise, yes.
Okay. And are you aware of the toxicology report that came back with Ms. Jones?
Yes.
Okay. And based on reviewing that toxicology report, did it factor into your determination of cause of death or her injuries or anything to that extent?
No.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I would ask to introduce State's Exhibits 385 and 386.
Any objection?
No objection to those reports.
They are allowed.
Dr. Scott, do those documents describe the height and weight of Melissa as you described yesterday? I think you said she was about 5'11 and a half, 180.
Yes, they do.
Okay, and also the injuries that you detailed for us yesterday, are they reflected in those two reports?
Primarily in the autopsy report, which is 385, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Scott, I'm going to hand you photographs that have been marked for identification purposes as 387 through 405. If you'll take a look at those documents and tell me if you recognize what they are. And please don't hold them up to the jury just yet.
Yes, these documents are the photographs taken during the autopsy of Melissa Huggins-Jones.
And do those photographs fairly and accurately represent the injuries that you saw about her during the autopsy?
And they do.
Okay, and you've mentioned chop wounds and broken bones and whatnot. Are those injuries depicted in these photographs?
Most of them, yes.
I'm going to hand you or show you what has been marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibits. Number 408, 407, and 406. Those 3 diagrams. Do you recognize those 3 diagrams, ma'am?
Yes, those 3 diagrams are the diagrams I made during the autopsy of Melissa Huggins-Jones, detailing her injuries.
And are those diagrams part of your autopsy report as well?
They are.
Just 406, 407, and 408 are blown-up versions of those diagrams?
That's correct.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask to introduce State's Exhibits 387 through 405 for substantive purposes, and 406 through 408 for illustrative purposes.
Any objection?
Yes, we would object to 387 through 405 for reasons previously stated, and 401, 402, 403, no telling rules of evidence and due process.
All right, those objections are overruled. 389 through 405 are allowed for substantive purposes, and 406 through 408 are allowed for illustrative purposes.
Is that 387, I'm sorry?
387 through 405 are substantive
Yes,
purposes.
Yes,
I'm sorry if I misspoke.
That's fine.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, at this time I would also ask to publish these photographs to the members of the jury using the screen, as well as use the diagrams as well on the tripod beside the screen.
Yes.
Is that a fine area to put those photographs in?
Can the jurors in the right side of the box see? That's fine. Good.
And permission for Dr. Scott to stand.
Yes.
Dr. Scott, I believe we're beginning with State's Exhibit number 387. Can you describe to the members of the jury what you see in that photograph?
State's Exhibit 387 was the identification photograph taken of Melissa Huggins-Jones. For every autopsy, we take a close-up of the decedent's face. There is a unique autopsy number in the photograph, but it seems to be cut off in the screen. We give each autopsy a unique identifier number. Also in this photograph, you can see some of her injuries. There is a laceration, again a blunt force injury on the right chin, a large laceration from the left nose to the right cheek. Underlying this laceration were fractures of the nasal bones, fractures of the upper jawbone, and the dislodged teeth that I described. Here is a small laceration on her left eyelid. And here is an abrasion on the central forehead. An abrasion is a blunt force injury where some object without a cutting edge rubs against the skin surface or hits the skin surface, wearing away the outer layer of the skin.
In this photograph, it appears that Melissa's nose is distorted in some way. Would that be consistent with the broken nose that you've described?
And that's correct. That would be consistent with the fractures of the bones in the nose.
And were there any broken bones in this area where you see the laceration?
Yes, so the upper jawbone is right underneath this laceration, and the upper jawbone here was broken. It was what we call a comminuted fracture, which means the bone was broken into several small pieces.
And in this photograph, and I believe there's a photograph that will depict it more clearly in a few minutes, but do her teeth appear to be broken and missing at this point?
No, that I could say for sure from this photograph. I think there is a photograph that shows it more clearly.
And then in using the diagram behind you, Dr. Scott, is that your report diagram that details the injuries here?
Yes, so this is the laceration across the nose to the right cheek. This is the abrasion on the central forehead. And there is a bruise on the nose. And
on your diagram, Dr. Scott, the body diagram, and I believe it's labeled head front and back. Do you indicate the length and the depth of these different lacerations and on that diagram?
Where I measured the depth, I indicate the depth. All injuries have a length measurement.
Okay. And can you tell the members of the jury the different depth and length of the different injuries that we see here on State's Exhibit 387, and you can use your report too if you need to.
This large laceration from the nose to the cheek measured 4 inches in length and 5 inches in width, or sorry, a half of an inch in width. This bruise on the nose measured a half an inch by a quarter of an inch. The small laceration on the left eyelid measured a quarter of an inch by a quarter of an inch. And the abrasion on the forehead measured 3/4 inches by 1/4 inch. For blunt force injuries, I typically don't do a depth measurement since they're not like a object that's penetrating into the skin. They're an object that just hit the skin surface and caused underlying damage.
Any other items of note on State's Exhibit 387, Dr. Scott, or on the diagram there in front of you?
Not that I would note, no.
We can go to 388. Again, what do you see there, Dr. Scott?
Diagram 388 is a close-up photograph of the injuries of her face, including the large laceration from the nose to the cheek, the abrasion on the forehead, the bruise on the nose, and the small laceration on the left eyelid. Here you can see a bit better on close-up that some of the teeth are at an angle that they shouldn't be at, and that is because they're slightly dislodged from the surface of the gum.
This large injury to her nose area, would you consider that a blunt force injury, a sharp object injury, or the combination of the both?
That I would consider a blunt force injury.
So no object involved with creating that injury?
Oh, there was a blunt force object involved, not a sharp force object. You can tell that it's blunt force versus sharp force because it has very ragged edges. And within the wound, you can't see it very well in the picture, but underlying the skin, there are some areas of what we call tissue bridging, where the inner layer of the skin is still connected with an instrument that has a sharp cutting edge. Those tissue bridges would not appear because they'd be cut through. With a blunt force injury, some of those tissue bridges hang on and don't completely get cut through with the force of the injury.
So this injury, Dr. Scott, would be consistent with a punch?
Yes.
And then how about the abrasion that you described earlier? Would that be consistent with a blunt force injury or a sharp object injury?
Again, a blunt force injury.
Now, when you do the photographs of a victim there at the medical examiner's office, do you just do surface photographs or external photographs?
Primarily, we do external photographs. We do some internal photographs as well.
And what's the purpose of doing an internal photograph?
To document any characteristic marks that were left on bone surfaces or characteristic fractures that might point us towards a potential weapon.
And so to be clear, for the internal photograph, you have to peel the person's skin back.
That's correct.
I'm going to go to State's Exhibit number 389 and tell me what you see there.
Exhibit 389 is a view of the back left of the decedent's head. This is her skull here. This is the flap of skin from the back of her skull being reflected back. And when I did that, it exposed two injuries that didn't have any corresponding bruises on the skin surface. This area of hemorrhage here, which would be in the left back of the head, and this injury here, an area of bleeding underneath the skin of the scalp on the left back to side of the head. These are also indicative of a blunt force injury, some blunt force object striking the head, or it could be the head striking some blunt force object. And there was no corresponding injury on the skin surface. This happens occasionally in the head, especially if it's an injury that happened recently. There's enough time for a bruise to develop on the skin surface, but we do see the bruise internally underneath the skin.
So this would be a recent injury as well?
Yes.
Okay. And you noted on your diagram, the body diagram, that there's no corresponding external injury that you found?
Correct.
And when you say a hemorrhage, Dr. Scott, what do you mean by a hemorrhage?
Bleeding.
And so would this be considered a brain bleed of some sort?
It's not a brain bleed because it's above the skull. The skull is here. It's a bleed just underneath the skin of the scalp. I don't believe there it is depicted in any of the pictures, and I didn't mention it before, but Melissa did also have some bleeding closer to the brain itself in the cerebellum, which is the area of the brain that underlies the main bulk of the brain. There was some subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is bleeding in between the brain and the membrane that surrounds the brain, and that is also indicative of blunt force injury.
How would an injury such as this, the hemorrhage that you've described, how would that affect a person?
A hemorrhage like this would not have much effect at all. And given the location of the subarachnoid hemorrhage and her other injuries, it probably wasn't significant in and of itself, but is a marker for other injuries.
And a marker for further blunt force trauma?
Yes.
We can go to State's Exhibit 390. What do you see there? Oh, sorry, 390.
390 is similar to the last picture, but a slightly further away view. So this is the skull, back part of the skull exposed, and the skin from the scalp reflected back to show those two areas of hemorrhage or bleeding underneath the skin of the scalp.
We can go to 391. And what do you see there, ma'am?
Exhibit 391 is a view of the right side of the face and head of Melissa Huggins-Jones. You can see the full extent of this large laceration across her nose to her cheek, which caused fracturing of the upper jawbone and the nasal bones. Here you can also see an injury that I described as a chop wound on the right forehead region.
And let me move this. At this point, we need one of the other diagrams. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm going to now post what has been marked as 407. I give you enough room. I'm sorry. Using 407, can you also describe these injuries to the members of the jury, please?
Yes, the extension of this large laceration from the nose to the right cheek and the chop wound on the right forehead.
And what is the depth and length of that chop wound?
The length of it was 1 inch, and I did not measure the depth of this wound. It wouldn't have been very deep. The extent of it ended at the skull, and there isn't much room between the skin and the skull, so it would have been less than 1/4 of an inch.
So this wound was not, it didn't penetrate the skin very much.
It penetrated completely through the skin, but the skin in this area isn't incredibly thick, and the skull lays very close underneath the skin.
Is that injury consistent, Dr. Scott, with the knife being moved in any way or the sharp object being moved in any way?
It could be consistent with a sharp object striking the skin in this motion instead of being dragged across or being inserted point first. It could also be consistent with a weapon such as an axe, a small axe that has a blade that is sharp but also has a blade that is sturdier than a knife blade that can inflict some blunt force trauma as well as some sharp force trauma.
Would you consider this injury just a sharp object trauma or blunt force trauma as well, or one of the combination wounds?
A combination of sharp and blunt force.
Anything else of note on that photograph, Dr. Scott?
No.
If we could go to 392. What do you see there?
Exhibit 392 is the front part of the skull with the skin reflected down, exposing the skull. This is where the chop wound was on the right forehead from the underside of the skin. You can see it penetrates all the way through the skin of the scalp and makes a corresponding mark, a partial fracture or gouge mark on the skull surface itself. And part of the skull is chipped away from where that instrument hit the skull.
So would you consider this, the top part of this photograph where the, okay, so this is where the skin is pulled down on the bottom half of the photograph?
Yes,
And then this is the actual skull.
and that's
All
correct.
right. Is that skull fractured there, Dr. Scott? Is the skull fractured there?
Yes, this is the skull fracture, and the bit of skull that chipped out from that fracture is lying here.
What type of force does it take to cause a skull fracture such as that?
It depends on the instrument that was used. If it was a heavier blade, a thinner blade, it would depend.
We can go to 393. What do you see there?
This is a close-up of the skull fracture underlying the chop wound. Picture's kind of upside down, so the top of her head would be up here and the bottom of the head would be down here. This is the fracture with the bit of bone that was chipped out from where that fracture occurred.
And in general, regardless of the instrument used, is it going to take a significant amount of force to break bone, such as a skull?
If it's a very heavy object, then it'll take less force. If it's a thinner object, then it'll take more force.
Such as a pocket knife?
If it was a pocket knife, then it would take a considerable amount of force.
394. What do you see there?
394 is a photograph of the left side of the face of Melissa Huggins-Jones. This is the continuation of the large laceration from her nose to her cheek. This is a smaller laceration on the left forehead that did not completely extend through the skin surface. This is the abrasion that was seen before on the central forehead. You can see the edge of a bruise up here on the upper left forehead. And then there are 3 injuries here which are primarily sharp force injuries but do have some evidence of blunt force trauma to them. This is primarily an incised wound of the left lower cheek, but its edges are ragged and abraded, and it has areas of abrasion at its edge, indicating that there was some blunt force combined with the sharp force injury that made this clean cut across the cheek. This injury did not extend very far. It did not extend completely through the skin of the cheek. Again, this is a combined sharp and blunt force injury. The area of abrasion around it is indicative of blunt force. The wound itself is primarily sharp force, a stab wound which extends through the cheek and hits the left upper jawbone, causing some fracturing of that bone. There'll be a slightly better picture of this lesion. This is a 3rd injury, which is primarily sharp force, but has some elements of blunt force to it at its outer edge. You can see an abrasion. The primary wound is sharp force extending into the tissue behind the ear, causing a laceration of the external carotid artery, which is an artery that supplies structures of the face, the tongue, and some neck structures. And that injury extends all the way back to the lower portion of the skull and leaves a small mark on the skull.
Are these injuries also depicted on the diagram beside you, Dr. Scott?
They are.
And can you describe those injuries further for us using that diagram?
This is the shallow laceration on the forehead.
That area right there?
Yes.
Okay.
This is the continuation of the laceration on the nose.
Okay.
This is the combined sharp and blunt force injury of the left cheek.
And when you go through these, I'm sorry, can you give us the general depth and length of these injuries as you go through them?
Yes, I'm going to refer to my diagram, which was a bit clearer. So the length of this was 1 inch. The depth of it was 1/4 of an inch. It did not penetrate completely through the skin of the cheek. This injury, the length was 3/4 inches, and it had a depth of 1 inch, impacting the jawbone and causing fracturing of that bone. And this injury has a length,
The one behind the ear?
yes, has a length of 1/2 inch, and it has a 1.5 inch depth into the tissue behind the ear, the upper neck, and the impacting the base of the skull behind the ear.
So the injury, this injury kind of in front of her ear on her cheek that's the injury that actually went as deep as to fracture her jaw.
Yes.
And that was 1 inch deep, you said?
Yes.
And this injury kind of below her ear went how far in?
1.5 inches.
And to the point where did it fracture her skull or just cause bruising? Tell us a little bit about the injury there.
It caused a partial fracture of the skull. It was a narrow mark on the skull, and I didn't have a corresponding internal picture for that one. It was similar to the mark on the right part of her skull, but not quite as deep.
And again, these injuries show a combination of blunt force and sharp object.
And that's correct.
Going to State's Exhibit number 395. Is that the close-up photograph you were referring?
Yes. So in this photograph, her chin is here, the top of her head would be here, her neck is here. You can see this injury, which is the one that fractured the jawbone. This was the superficial injury, which did not go completely through the skin. And this is the injury that extended for about 1.5 inches to impact the base of the skull. Coming down from the edge of this injury is an incised wound. So a small cut indicative of some sharp force object being dragged across the skin surface.
So to be clear, you're talking about the injury from below her neck to going down the photograph?
Yes.
And that injury is consistent with a knife or some other sharp object being dragged across her skin?
Yes.
We've seen a photograph similar to this from the crime scene that obviously had more blood on it. As part of your autopsy, do you clean the person up before
Yes.
performing this examination?
Yes.
And is the knife or the sharp object drag, is it represented on your diagram as well?
It is represented here, and it had a length of 3 inches.
Anything else of note on that photograph, Dr. Scott?
Not that I would know, no.
I'm going to go 396. What do you see there?
This is another image of the lesions on her left cheek to below the left ear. Again, exhibiting that they have a combination of sharp force and blunt force with abrasions at their edges.
Do you, as part of your autopsy, do these scale diagrams as we see here in this photograph to make notes in regards to the length and width and depth of injuries?
I make measurements at the time of the autopsy, not afterwards, but the rulers such as this are better for photographic purposes for capturing the actual size of the wounds.
397.
Exhibit 397 is a view of the left forehead, and there is a bruise here, bruise being blunt force injury, which causes blood vessels under the skin surface to break and cause bleeding. And this is the laceration we saw before on the upper part of her forehead. This was a shallow laceration which did not extend through the complete thickness of the skin. This bruise has an outline that could be reminiscent of the object that caused the bruise. It could have been an object that had a right angle such as this that struck the skin surface and made that outline.
Anything else of note on that photograph? Then your corresponding diagram.
In the corresponding diagram, that bruise is here and that laceration is here.
And what are the measurements in regards to that abrasion and also the laceration?
The part of the bruise that extends here measured 3/4 inches. This part also measures 3/4 inches. And this central part measured 1/4 by 1/2 inch. This laceration measured a 1/2 inch.
Thank you. 398.
398 is a close-up view of the bruise on her left forehead that has areas of patterning with this right angle being outlined on the skin surface.
Appears to be a red substance in her hair. Is that consistent with blood?
Yes.
399.
399 is a view of the right chin and neck. There's a laceration here on the chin and a sharp force injury, an incised wound, which means it was superficial and did not penetrate deeply into the skin. On the junction of the chin and the neck, you can see that this has ragged edges, and you can't see in the picture that there is tissue bridging in this wound as well, so areas of the underlying skin are still connected, indicating that it wasn't cut cleanly with a sharp object.
And when you say it wasn't cut cleanly, what do you mean by that, Dr. Scott? Is there some movement of the blade or the object or the sharp object?
It indicates a blunt force object rather than a sharp force object. A sharp force object will make a complete cut through the entire layer of the skin or the entire upper layer of the skin. A blunt force object will not cut completely through the skin since it's not actually entering the skin surface, it's just impacting the skin. So some of the underlying layers of the skin will stay clinging to each other rather than being cut cleanly through.
And what are the measurements on these injuries?
This measured a 1/4 inch in length, and this also measured a 1/4 inch in length.
Thank you. And I believe, is that the extent of the injuries that we have seen, or the extent of the injuries for the head and neck area?
And that's correct.
Okay, so the injuries that you just described were the 18 injuries or 18 blows that you described to the jury yesterday and then again today.
They're part of the 18 blows. The 18 included some to the upper chest and shoulders.
I'm sorry, the 12.
Yes.
There were 12
Yes.
to the head and neck area. Okay, so at this point we will move to the body of Melissa, and if I may have just a moment to change those diagrams.
Yes.
We can go to 400. What do you see in State's Exhibit 400?
Exhibit 400 is a view of the right shoulder here and the right upper chest. The neck and head would be extending out this way. There are 3 lesions in this picture. There is this injury on the back part of the right shoulder, which was a sharp force injury that did not extend very far into the body. There is this injury, which didn't have enough characteristics for me to tell if it was completely sharp force, completely blunt force, or a combination of the two. And there is this injury here, which is the puncture wound I described before, which extended for 1/2 inch into the body surface, forming a very thin and narrow tract, which ended at the collarbone.
And are those injuries on State's Exhibit 400 also reflected on the diagram you see before you?
They are. This is the injury that I cannot tell if it is sharp or blunt force. This is the sharp force injury on the back of the right shoulder. And this is the puncture wound.
And what are the measurements on those injuries, Dr. Smith?
And this injury measured 2.5 inches in length. This was a 1/2 inch in length. And the puncture wound, don't know if I've got a measurement of that. Judging from the diagram, it looks to be about somewhere between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch.
The puncture wounds that you described, Dr. Scott, were they odd to you in any way?
This one especially on the right side, since it was so long and deep, seemed to be made with a different object than her other injuries. The one on the left side was very shallow and could have been made with a knife tip.
Anything else of note on 400 or using the diagram?
No.
State's Exhibit 401.
State's Exhibit 401 is a view of the left shoulder and left neck. The shoulder is up here, the neck is here. There is a chop wound on the shoulder here. Again, a chop wound being a wound that has a combined sharp and blunt force elements to it. This is the chop wound which extended for 1 inch, hitting the collarbone and causing partial fracture of the collarbone. This is the puncture wound I just mentioned, which was very shallow and could have been caused by a knife tip. This is another view of the superficial incised wound made by some sharp object scratching across the skin surface that extended up from that lesion behind the ear and down.
And I believe you said earlier that that scratch extended 3 inches.
That's correct.
And is this the same puncture wound that we saw in State's Exhibit 400?
No, this is on the opposite side. This is on the left top of the chest. The other one was on the right top of the chest.
And again, you mentioned in State's Exhibit 400 that you thought that puncture wound appeared to be odd, or I guess inconsistent with the other injuries that you saw in terms of the sharp object that could have inflicted it.
The previous one, yes, this one was very shallow and could have been a knife tip or some other sharp tip of an instrument.
I know you said it, but what was the measurement on this wound?
That was 1.5 inches, and the depth was 1 inch.
And that's the injury that corresponds to the collarbone, is that right?
Yes.
And when you saw that injury, did you take some internal photographs of the injury that would have been inflicted to the collarbone based on this injury or this chop wound there?
Yes.
We'll go to State's Exhibit number 402, and what do you see there?
This is the skin reflected back from the region of the collarbone. This is the reflected back skin here. This is the left collarbone here. And this is the partial fracture of the collarbone at the outer edge of the collarbone.
You talked about the skull fracture earlier, and again, you said it would depend on the instrument that was used, but what type of force would be needed to inflict a fracture such as this to the collarbone?
Again, it depends on the instrument used. If it's a heavier blade, then it's going to take less force. If it's a thinner blade, then it's going to take more force.
So something like a pocket knife would take more force.
Yes.
If we can go to 403.
Exhibit 403 is a close-up of the outside edge of the collarbone with the fracture here.
And taking that force question one step further, a closed fist or a punch to the collarbone, is it possible to break the collarbone with a closed fist punch?
The characteristics of this wound were not consistent with just a blunt force injury. They appear to have a sharp force component to it. There's a very nice narrow outline on the bone surface for this partial fracture, so a blunt force object could not have caused this.
Anything else to note on 403? That's just a close-up view of it. 404.
404 is a view of the back of the left shoulder. So this is the left arm extending down here, the neck up here, the left shoulder pulled down slightly. And this is an injury that I also described as a chop wound. It had elements of both sharp and blunt force to it. It extended for a depth of 1 inch upwards into the musculature of the upper left arm to left shoulder.
And how long was that wound?
The depth of that was 1 inch. And, the length of it was 3/4 inches. And it is shown on the diagram here.
There appears to be some discoloration of Melissa's skin at this point. Can you describe what that discoloration would be?
That discoloration is called lividity. It's settling of blood just due to the effects of gravity after death. When the blood's no longer pumping through the system, it begins to settle in dependent portions of the body through the effects of gravity. So it's a post-mortem artifact, not anything indicative of a injury.
You testified, I believe, yesterday, and again, I guess this morning as well, that you did notice some bruises, and I want to talk to you a little bit about those later on. But are you able to tell the difference between the bruising and what you see in terms of what would have happened post-mortem?
Yes, the bruises that occurred before death are not on portions of the body that were subject to the effects of gravity. And the lividity is more extensive. It covers a larger portion of the body surface. It covers the entire portion that's going to be exposed to gravity and be in an independent position.
You go to 405.
Exhibit 405 is a view of the right hand. It shows a injury here that I couldn't necessarily categorize as sharp versus blunt force. There's also a small abrasion here, which to me looked like a post-mortem injury. It was dry and had a more orange discoloration to it. This was an injury inflicted before death.
Using 405, but just in general, Dr. Scott, were you able to tell if there were any what we would call defensive wounds about Melissa?
There were wounds that could be categorized as defensive type wounds. We don't call anything specifically defensive wounds, since there are other ways to get wounds on your hands and arms besides through defending yourself. This could be a defensive type injury. It could have been caused by some other mechanism. The bruises that were on her arms, which I do not have pictures of, also could be categorized as defensive type wounds. They may have occurred when she was trying to defend herself against some blunt force object. They may have occurred through some other mechanism.
And we'll go to that bruising now. Are the bruises depicted on the diagram that you created?
They are.
Okay, and can you outline those bruises for the members of the jury, of course?
There's a bruise on the front part of the left arm behind the elbow. There is a bruise on the front of the left wrist. There are several bruises, 4 in total, on the back of the left forearm. There are 3 bruises on the right elbow. And then on the legs, there are several bruises extending from the left thigh down to below the left knee. There are 3 bruises on the right knee, a single bruise on the front of the right lower leg, and a single bruise on the back of the left knee.
And do these bruises appear to have been created or happened at the same time as the other injuries that you've described to us?
I can't say that they occurred at exactly the same time. They occurred near the time of death.
So they would have occurred prior to the lividity that you
Yes.
described earlier. And again, and I don't necessarily make you go through all of them, but again, do you take the measurements of these bruises when you go through the examination?
Yes.
Were there any bruises that were larger to you, or stood out to you in any way, or were they all about the same size?
They were all within the same size range. This one was slightly larger than some of the others, but they were within the same range.
And you're referring to a bruise there on her
On the
leg.
front of the left leg.
In general, Dr. Scott, these bruises, are they caused by blunt force trauma or sharp object trauma? Or
Blunt force trauma.
Blunt force only. Thank you, Doctor. You've now gone through all the injuries that we've talked about, and during the course of your examination, do you form an opinion as to cause of death?
Yes.
What was your opinion as to cause of death for Melissa Huggins-Jones?
Blunt and sharp force injuries of the head and neck. Blunt and sharp force injuries of the torso may have been contributory to death.
And we've seen all the injuries that were inflicted upon her. Was there one injury in particular that would have been a lethal blow?
There were several that were more severe than others, but it was a combination of all the injuries that led to her death. The mechanism would have been hemorrhaging from these various injuries. The combined blood loss from all of the injuries contributed to her death.
And when you say hemorrhaging in kind of layman's terms, she was bleeding out.
Bleeding, yes.
How long would it have taken for her to bleed out and die?
It depends on which injuries occurred first and if they all occurred within several minutes versus a longer time frame. So there isn't a great way to say exactly when, assuming they all occurred at around the same time frame. And granting that I can't tell which injury occurred first, second, third, most likely it was within the order of several minutes.
Could it have been longer than several minutes?
It could have been.
How long would you say is the maximum of the time that it would have taken her to bleed out?
And assuming all the injuries happened at around the same time frame, probably an hour would have been the maximum.
So it took her from anywhere from several minutes to an hour to die.
Yes.
During the course of while she's bleeding out, is she conscious of what's going on to her?
She would have been, yes.
And what do you mean by that, Dr. Scott?
She would have known that she had these injuries and likely would have known that she was beginning to lose consciousness from the loss of blood from the injuries.
And knowing that she was dying.
Yes.
I don't have any questions.
Cross-examination, Mr. Brown.
Yes, just briefly, Your Honor. Dr. Scott, you cannot, you're here to talk about what injuries happened, but you're not able to have anything about who caused the injuries. Is that
No.
correct? And I just want to clarify one thing, because I know there has been some talk about rape kits and sexual assault kits. You found no evidence of either rape kits or sexual assault?
I collected a rape kit at the time of autopsy, which includes taking swabs of the mouth, the vagina, and the anus, and submitted that to the CCBI agent who was there at the time of autopsy. I don't know what the findings were of that rape kit. At the time of autopsy, I saw a small area of abrasion on her labia, her external genitalia. It was not in any way specific for rape. It could have been caused by any number of things.
Okay, not the injuries. The main injuries you saw were in other parts of the body.
Yes.
With that, and you can't tell from it which injuries happened first and what type of injuries happened first and which injuries happened later.
And that's correct. I know that they all occurred around the time of death, but which one occurred first, second, third, I can't say from the autopsy.
And the injuries, I think you described that there were chop injuries, blunt force injuries, and sharp injuries. Is that correct?
Yes.
And all three could have caused bleeding?
All of them contributed to her death, yes.
Caused bleeding?
Caused bleeding, yes.
Yes. All right. Wait 1 second. Of your collection process, you took clippings, toenail clippings, and fingernail clippings from Ms. Huggins-Jones?
Just fingernail clippings, not toenail clippings.
But fingernail clippings from her.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. That's all I have.
Mr. Waller. Thank you, ma'am. You may step down. Further evidence for the state?
Your Honor, this time the state doesn't have any further witnesses to call. I would ask, there are several stipulations that I believe we need to address, and if we may just have a few moments to address those.
Yes.
And we'll, but after that, I believe state will rest at that point.
parties had signed to. The one regarding the latent lifts, I have the state's exhibit numbers written in, if that would be helpful to you,
Yes.
or I can add it to the one that Your Honor has.
That would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
But before you read that stipulation, I would ask, and I think I neglected to ask Ms. Southern, she referenced State's Exhibit 336, which was the latent lifts that she had done. I've neglected to move that into evidence, but it was part of that stipulation. So formally, I would ask to do it, but it's also part of that.
I'm sorry, what number is that?
336.
All right. And any objection?
No objection.
All right, that's allowed.
And I've handed you the numbers for the State's exhibits with those various lift cards.
And you wish for me to read that to the jury?
Please, Your Honor.
All right. So members of the jury, this is a stipulation, which means that it is an agreement by the state and the defense that the jury may accept these to be true without further proof. And I'll just read this in its entirety. These are stipulations regarding prints taken from downstairs leasing office, CCBI 13-003158. Number one, that CCBI item 12, States Exhibit 332, contains 20 latent lifts contacted by Agent Foreign on May 14, 2013, from the downstairs leasing office. These lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003158, latent lifts 1 through 20. Number two, that CCBI item 32, States Exhibit 333, contains 41 latent lifts collected by Agent Foreign on May 15, 2013. From the downstairs leasing office, these lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003158, latent lifts 21 through 62. Number three, that CCBI item 33, States Exhibit 334, contains 36 latent lifts collected by Agent Foreign on May 15, 2013. From the downstairs leasing office, these lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003158, latent lifts 63 through 99. Number four, that CCBI item 34, States Exhibit 335, contain 8 latent lifts collected by Agent Foreign on May 17, 2013 from items processed at the CCBI laboratory, including the iPad box and case, key paper, and a candy wrapper. These lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003158, latent lifts 100 through 107. Number five, that CCBI item 42, States Exhibit 336, contains 8 photographs taken by Melissa Southern, CCBI forensic photographer, of latent impressions originally lifted by Agent Foreign on May 14, 2013 from the downstairs leasing office. These lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003158, latent photographs 108 through 115. And 6, that CCBI items 12, 32, 33, 34, and 42 were delivered to Agent Rene Manella in a sealed fashion for latent print analysis in CCBI case 13-003158. These stipulations relate to prints taken from upstairs apartment belonging to Melissa Huggins-Jones, CCBI case number 13-003149. That CCBI item 21, States Exhibit 220, contained 24 lifts collected by Tracy Gold on May 14, 2013 from the exterior of the upstairs apartment and Honda vehicle. These lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003149, latent lifts 1 through 24. Number 8, that CCBI item 38, States Exhibit 221, contains 26 latent lifts collected by Tracy Gold on May 15, 2013 from the upstairs apartment. These lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-013149. Excuse me, let me read that number again. 13-003149, latent lifts 25 through 51. Number 9, that CCBI item 48, States Exhibit 222, contains 2 latent lifts collected by Tracy Gold on May 15, 2013 from the upstairs apartments. These lifts are labeled as CCBI case 13-003149, latent lifts 52 through 53. Number 10, that CCBI item 55, States Exhibit 223, contains 5 latent lifts collected by Tracy Gold on May 17, 2013, from items processed by the CCBI laboratory, including an iTunes card, a Leah Sophia jewelry box, and a broken window blind. These lifts are labeled as CCBI Case 13-003149, latent lifts 54 through 58. And number 11, that CCBI items 21, 38, 48, and 55 were delivered to Agent Rene Manella in a sealed fashion for latent print analysis in CCBI Case 13-003149. All right, is that the agreement and stipulation of counsel, Ms. Shakita?
Yes, sir.
Ms. D? Very well.
And there was the other stipulation as to a date, Judge.
All right, so this is another stipulation that's been agreed to by counsel, and again, members of the jury can accept this as true. This stipulation reads as follows, that Travion Smith was residing with his father until April 11, 2013. On April 11, 2013, his father told Travion Smith he no longer wanted him to reside in his home, and he did not reside at the home any time prior to his arrest on May 22nd. This date is incorrect.
2013, it should be.
Right. Is that correct? 2013. All right. He did not reside at his home at any time prior to his arrest on May 22, 2013. Is that the stipulation, Ms. Shakita?
Yes, sir.
And Ms. D?
Yes, we agree.
All right. Very well. Anything further from the state?
Your Honor, at this time, and by agreement with the defense attorneys, we would ask to introduce State's Exhibit number 409, which is a booking photograph and identifying information for Sarah Redden. State's Exhibit number 410, which is the booking photograph and identifying information for Ronald Anthony. And State's Exhibit 411, which is the booking photograph and identifying information for Travion Smith, including date of birth, height, and weight for each individual. I would ask to introduce those and publish them to the members of the jury at this point.
Any objection? All right, they're received and may be published to the jury. Bailiff, if you'll just pass those, why don't you divide them? Send one down one row and the other down the other row.
Just that we've checked with Madam Clerk, and it appears that all the evidence is in, but I just wanted to make sure with the court's records as well that State's Exhibit number 12 and 12A, which would be the iPhone, that it was admitted into evidence. Identified by Miss.
12A are in evidence.
That they are. State's Exhibit number 26, which I believe was an evidence envelope for the camera.
My notes reflect they're in evidence, but ultimately the clerk would have the most accurate notes if you've already checked with her.
We've checked, and those appear to be in. State rest.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the state's evidence. At this time, I'm going to, there are some matters I need to take up with counsel outside your presence. So I'm going to go ahead and call a recess for your benefit, and then I'll bring you back. If this is going to take longer than what I will originally estimate, I'll bring you back and give you further instructions. But I ask you to return to the deliberation room at 11:15. That's about 20 minutes from now. Let me go over the instructions one more time. It's very important that you continue to follow all these instructions. Don't talk about this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters. Please have no conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. Leave your notepads in your chairs, and again, gather at 11:15. Everyone else, please remain seated. All right, outside the presence of the jury at the close of the state's evidence, I'll entertain any motions that are made at this time, as well as I'd like to take the opportunity to discuss with Mr. Smith his decision about whether he will testify or not testify in this case.
And we would like to have a break before particular inquiry.
All right. What I'd like to do is advise him about the personal nature of that decision before we take the break, but I'll certainly hear his decision after you've had an opportunity to speak with him further.
That would be fine.
All right. Go ahead, sir.
We would, at the end of the state's evidence, move for non-suit or move for dismissal of the charges based on insufficiency of the evidence.
All right. That motion is denied. Any further motions at this time? Anything else? All right. All right, Mr. Smith, I wanted to talk to you very briefly about a decision that you need to make. First of all, let me remind you that you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. This decision is a personal decision, namely it's one that you must make alone. You should carefully consider the advice of your counsel and consult with your counsel about this decision, and you should carefully consider their advice, but ultimately it is your decision alone. You should not make the decision, not allow the decision to be made by anyone else other than yourself. That decision is whether you will testify in this trial. If you do choose to testify, there are some consequences of that. Most significantly, if you testify, you'll be waiving your constitutional privilege against self-incrimination. And what that means is that you will be required to answer truthfully to questions that are posed to you both by your attorneys as well as questions that are posed to you by the prosecution. The other issue that you should bear in mind with respect to testifying is at this stage in the trial, I know we'll probably talk further about this, but your attorney likely has the opportunity to make the final closing argument to this jury. If you choose to testify, or if the defense offers any evidence, then your attorney will lose the right to make the final closing argument, but the state will have the opportunity to make the final closing argument. So that's another consequence you should consider as you make this decision. What I'm going to do is, first of all, ask you now, if you wish to answer, whether you understand what I've just explained to you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now we're going to go ahead and take a break and allow you to consult further with your counsel. Counsel, it's 15 minutes. All right. And at the end of that break, I'm going to ask you for a decision on whether you're going to testify or not, so that we can just simply plan accordingly as to how we proceed for the remainder of the day. All right, very good. So we'll go ahead and be in recess. And is there anything we need to take up before we recess?
No, sir, thank you.
All right. Then we'll be in recess for 15 minutes.
Superior Court stands in recess 15 minutes.